All right. Thanks, Brandon. And thanks for everybody for joining the learning session. I know it's kind of hard to lure you away from the shiny paint out on the floor, but just know that knowledge does not depreciate as fast as farm equipment. So it's a good investment in your time to be here today. There we get the mic. Okay, so we'll kind of just, over the next 40 to 45 minutes here, lay the land. First, we'll start off with introducing you to the four of us up here on the stage. We'll get into a conversation on nutrient runoff. What does it look like to monitor and research that runoff? Carbon intensity scores, soil health, what does it all mean and how can we get better at managing this issue? And then ultimately we'll kind of tie things together with some opportunities and programs for y'all to consider as you leave the show here today. So I'll just start off with myself. So my name is Jeff Divan. I'm the Director of Agronomy for Sound Agriculture. So we develop and sell products that stimulate soil biology and activate that soil to deliver more to your fields. In addition to that, I have a 2,500 acre corn soybean operation in north central Iowa that I hope to hand off to my little 1-year-old at some point. Brandon.
Yeah, besides being co-chair for Commodity Classic, I also farm in south central Nebraska with my dad and my brother. We farm about 2,400 acres of corn, soybeans, and popcorn. Everything's fully irrigated. We're always concerned about water quality and nitrogen, just where we're at in Nebraska, and I'll get into that a little bit more later.
Hey everyone, thanks for hanging out here after lunch. My name is Mitchell Hora. I'm a 7th generation farmer from southeast Iowa. We're about 700 acre row crop operation down there. Corn, soybeans, quite a bit of cereal rye, and dabbled in a variety of other things as well. I'm the founder and CEO of Continuum Ag. We're a software company helping farmers to manage all this data, quantify carbon intensity scores, get verified carbon intensity scores so we can tell our story in the supply chain, make sure that farmers are the ones controlling that data and control the narrative. So we'll talk on that here a little bit more.
Good afternoon, everyone. John Bokmeyer. I'm the director of Ag Ingenuity Partners, which is the research division of Advanced Analytics. Advanced Analytics is a direct-to-farm agronomic guidance company, which really specializes in understanding the environment to help growers make the best decisions with their inputs and their resources.
All right, so you can see a variety of folks represented here, and it should be a fun discussion as we get into it. So I'll just kind of start off and set the stage a little bit about why we have this challenge with water quality and really the role that nutrients play in it. So first of all, we have this issue because we have aggressive yield targets, and that's not a bad thing. That's fine. We have a lot of grain to produce, and we need supplemental fertilizer to get there and achieve those goals. So there's different options. Some people have access to natural sources, such as manure, but a lot of us have to go the synthetic route, and those products have some challenges, and they can be prone to loss. But when we think about fertilizer, logistics oftentimes trumps agronomic consideration. And what do I mean by that? So let's take corn, for example. About 50 to 60% of the nitrogen and phosphorus that a corn plant uses is taken up during grain fill, right? The back half of the season. When does most of that product get applied? Well before that, right? Probably 9 months before that in a lot of cases, in the fall prior. Why do we do that? Because it's easy, right? We have time. It's typically drier in the fall. It's just when it makes sense to do logistically. So we are displacing agronomic reasons with logistics. So when we front load that product, we've done it because it's easy, like we said, but now what are we faced with? And we're faced with losses. So when we put these products, whether it be nitrogen products, phosphate products on the soil, they are trying to get off the soil chemically from the day that they get put on, right? So they're exposed to air, they can volatilize, leave the soil, they can become dissolved and leave with water. They're trying to escape really from the moment that they're applied. So what do? We put on a little extra, right? And you've all heard these terms. We'll put on a little extra nitrogen as insurance, right? We'll make sure we get to the end with some gas in the tank. Or we'll build the phosphorus soil bank, right? Even if I don't use it this year, it'll be there next year. So we've developed these habits of putting on extra just so we have enough, but not thinking about the other side of the equation is what does extra mean? What is the cost of extra, right? There's a financial cost. Sometimes we realize that in poorer times of commodity prices like now than others, but there are different costs associated there. So when we carry a high balance, it's exposed to loss. And when we carry that high balance, what are we seeing with weather events lately, right? Specifically rain events. They're getting intense. So there are less of them, and they're more intense. So instead of the nice 1-inch soaker overnight, we get 2 inches in 45 minutes, right, as the squall line rolls through. So we're carrying a high balance because logistically it's easy, and now we've exposed it to the extreme weather events that we're experiencing. So ultimately, we need technology and we need programs or incentives to be comfortable reducing that excess and reducing that buffer and putting on just the right amount. And that's, I think, what the conversation will be about here today. So one of those opportunities is to leverage biology, right? So the soil has a wonderful ability to deliver nutrients and to buffer some of those challenges that the weather throws at us. And it's very often we talk about all the microbes in terms of quantity, right? Billions, however many billions you hear in the talk that you're listening to. And sometimes we stop with that number and it sounds impressive. But I think what's equally impressive is how complex some of those processes are of what biology can deliver. So if we think about nitrogen for a second, the Haber-Bosch process, which has been around for 100 years, uses a ton of energy. So 2,500 pounds of pressure, almost 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, you force together nitrogen and hydrogen and you get ammonia. That's great. What's impressive is one little bacteria in the soil can do that exact same process. You just have to feed it a little bit of energy, right? Some carbohydrates. So when you look at such a massive industrial process, it can also be done in the soil, and it can be done at a large scale if the right considerations and interactions exist. So another one is phosphate solubilizers. So phosphorus has a tendency to get tied up, and I kind of showed that in the last slide. 80% or so of the phosphorus you put on is immediately tied up in the soil and not available. One form that ends up in is calcium phosphate, which is pretty much like bone in your arm, right? Pretty hard to get bone into a plant root. But these bacteria and this biology can actually break that down and create a plant-available form. We just have to feed them a little bit of carbohydrates, right? You see the theme here. Once that biology is stimulated, it can do a lot of great things. Plants know that this economy works well. So about 40% of the sugar, which is a byproduct of the photosynthesis process, ends up below ground, right? So you think of how much corn plant is above ground and how much energy that takes. Almost half of that actually ends up below ground. That plant knows that that's where that energy needs to go to sustain itself and to support that production. So at the end of the day, how do we better leverage that biology? And we need them activated and we need them associated with plant roots. That happens to be one of the ways that the source product interacts with the soil to support that, and be happy to talk about that later. But what's more important is the discussion here beside me, which is how and why all of these things come together in the way that they do. So John, I'll go to you first, and you mentioned kind of your background in research. We can agree, I think, generally that nutrients are leaving the soil, but that sounds hard to measure. What's your approach been to that problem?
Yep. Thanks, Jeff. As a company, as I mentioned, understanding the environment, starting with the environment, is really critical when we think about how we're going to manage nutrients. And so with that being the case, we have implemented our controlled environment plots at our Huntington Research Facility in Indiana, and it really is based on wanting to understand in the environment that are going to exist in growers' fields and ultimately be able to measure in the tile line what's actually occurring. So to be able to do this, we have 48 plots, and each of these plots that you see in the image there on the left are 40 feet wide by 300 feet long, and they all have irrigation running into subsurface drip irrigation running to each plot, so we can independently create a saturated environment right next to a rain-fed environment. And with that, we also have a tile line that's running down the border of each plot so we can prevent bleeding over from the different plots. And then we have a tile line running down the middle of each of these plots that then feeds into a catch basin. And that's what that image there on the right is. That's our catch basin, where we have a pumping system in there that we're able to monitor how much water is leaving that tile or that plot, and then be able to siphon off over a 24-hour period throughout the growing season a water sample that we can then take for analysis and understand what did we put on the plot, how much water left the plot, and what was the nutrient load that was in that water that went through the tile line, so that we can really accurately measure what is occurring with the different management practices and how that's occurring by environment. And I think if we can just see how we're tracking, why do we want to start with environment and water being so critical? Just by show of hands, I'm going to ask a question just to make sure we're all paying attention after lunch. If I'm standing on the top of a hill, right, and water's running away from me, raise your hand if in a dry year on the top of the hill, that's the first place that it's going to get dry in a field. So do we think it's going to get dry first on the top of the knob in a dry year? I see hands going up. Now here's a trick question. In a wet year, is it going to get dry first there? Raise your hands. Absolutely. So we can't predict what Mother Nature is going to do, but we can isolate the environment where water's going to be running to, where it's going to be saturated. And ultimately, we're trying to understand how can we mitigate risks associated with those environments in a field. So Jeff, go to the next slide. The research that we've done now is to really understand by environment what are the risks. And what I have here for you is just a representation of some research that we've done a couple years ago, that we were looking at what happens when, as Jeff was talking about, that fall fertilizer application. So we came out in the fall for these plots and we applied 156 pounds of P2O5 per acre to some plots, and then we had, as a comparison, controls where we applied 0 pounds of P2O5 in the fall. So that's where the blue line is where we fertilized, and the orange line is our control line. But as we said, we know that as we think about water movement poses different risks. So we created that following spring during the growing season a saturated environment. So half the plots in this study received 120% of irrigation relative to the evapotranspiration demand of the crop. So what does that mean? We created a wet environment. And with that, we were able to monitor daily what water was leaving the tile, through the tile line, and how much nutrient or how much P2O5 did we see in that. And that's really what I just want to show here in a really simple format is on the left, you have that saturated plot, and you can see where that blue line throughout the season, starting from May till September, when we did daily water collections, we continued to lose a greater amount of P2O5 coming out of the tile line compared to the control. And on the right side, that's the rain-fed environment. And we can see that in that rain-fed environment where we did not have as much moisture, we don't have as much separation between the control and where we applied fertilizer. And what this should be telling us is we have different risks of loss by environment. And that's what our goal is not to try to treat everything the same, but to manage that risk. So where we have moisture, we know we're at a greater loss for losing nutrients. It's here, it's evident in the slide, and that's why I even point out where we had a rain event. Where we had a rain event early in the season, you get that flushing. You can see in that first part of May, we have a flushing even in the control, right, of what's available in the soil. So we know water is our risk. How do we manage that? And so that was really how we think about this research, Jeff, of what's occurring in the subfield environment. And then if you go forward, we can think about, well, what does that mean for us in the industry as we think about managing our fields? So here is, on the left, is a character of a field where we are identifying in that field where am I at risk for saturation. And that dark red is areas where I'm at risk for that. And on the right is my phosphorus soil test levels. And you can see that green is where we have a greater concentration. And if you compare these two images, you can see where I have a greater risk for saturation is also where I already have naturally higher phosphorus levels in the soil. And we just showed you on the previous slide, that's where I'm at a greater risk for losing it. So that's what we need to be managing, is how do we reduce that risk in these environments? And so how we think about that, Jeff, is if you click one more time, is to actually really consider those areas of the field. Instead of thinking a single rate makes sense across a field where I know I have different risks of loss, we approach it from what we would consider our spatial critical level. And there you can see this is how we think about a field when it comes to nutrient management. And for phosphorus, that area where we have low need for that critical level of phosphorus, you can see that that's tied back to areas where we have already a greater risk for saturation and more phosphorus available for diffusion. So we're going to pull back what we're applying there so we can reduce loss and use what's available through the diffusion process, and then we will have a different level needed for those areas that are drier and have less opportunity for risk. So again, for us, it was really important to be able to accurately monitor what are these management practices actually doing into the tile line, and then make sure that our recommendations are based on what reduces the overall risk.
Perfect. So let's switch gears to nitrogen for just a second. John, I'll stick with you. So we've done some work historically where we've looked at different nitrogen rates, potentially lower nitrogen rates than grower standard practice, and supplementing with biology and leveraging that soil nitrogen source. How has that tracked and looked within that method of research that you just displayed?
Yeah. Yeah, as Jeff mentioned, we've had research in the past looking at source in particular, where we can make two different comparisons. One, full rate of nitrogen and then a reduced rate, and then with and without the application of source. And instead of looking at phosphorus, we were tracking what is the overall nitrate load that was in the water line. And what we've been able to see is, as you would expect, when you have reduction in nitrogen rates, you do see a reduction in the nitrate that's in the tile line. And then the really important question that we wanted to answer is, as you add source and you have the ability to unlock more nitrogen available to the plant, does that negatively impact what's ending up in the tile line? Meaning, do we increase nitrates when we utilize source compared to the control at the same nitrogen rate? And the research said, no, we don't do that. We don't see a negative impact while we're able to also be able to measure more nitrogen in the plant with the source application. So really great to be able to see how source is able to be utilized in those scenarios through the research.
Great. Mitchell, I'll head your way next. So soil health gets talked about in a variety of ways. What are your thoughts on, first off, how it can be measured just from a soil health standpoint? And then what strategies or what things can someone do to improve where they're at today?
Yeah.
Might need that one.
Testing. There we go. Now we're live. All right. Yeah, I think, it's a systems approach, right? Especially as we're talking about soil health, we're talking about mimicking Mother Nature. We're talking about farming in Mother Nature's image. We're talking about building up the natural function, the natural system to be able to avoid, negative outcomes, stuff like what we were just talking. And it takes sometimes some of these products that we're applying, but also some of these practices, such as reducing tillage, using cover crop, some of those kind of things. So as we're looking at building soil health, we measure it. I like using the Haney soil health test to measure and to track progress. The Haney test quantifies the nutrients that are in your soil, just like you've done with traditional soil sampling. But the Haney test, that's Haney, the Haney test also quantifies the biological activity. It also quantifies the water extractable organic carbon, the food for the microbes. So if we have more food, we can get more biological activity, we can get better nutrient cycling, more efficiencies. So building up biology, though, building up soil health typically takes implementing these principles in conjunction, with a variety of things that we can add from off the farm to drive this faster. So it's about keeping the armor on the soil to avoid erosion, protect moisture, suppress weeds, reduce chemical and physical disturbance. I think a lot of times we think about building soil health means no-till, right, or strip-till, but also I think managing the chemical inputs, whether that be pesticides or fertilizers like we're talking today. So we've got to just optimize those inputs. Mother Nature wants balance, right? Anytime we throw Mother Nature out of balance, we are hurting some of those microbes along the way. Maintaining living roots, photosynthesis is what gathers that CO2 and pumps it into the ground. And more diverse species that we can get out there, the more diverse function we can get below ground. Like Jeff, you were talking about that, billions of microbes in just 1 teaspoon of soil. And the more diverse compounds we can pump in, the more diverse function we can drive in the soil. Livestock can be a great part of the system, but it's all about context. How these principles are implemented on my farm in Southeast Iowa is different than Brandon's in Nebraska, different than yours in your neck of the woods, but you've got to be committed. And the number one thing as we talk with farmers about building soil health, there's a lot of talk at this conference about sustainability, right? And I'm going to talk in a bit about some of the outcomes that we can drive, but number one, we've got to be on the offense here. We've got to be on the offense and thinking about implementing these practices just as much of an offensive tool as utilizing a product, utilizing a fertilizer input, utilizing those things that we can buy to gain an offensive outcome, typically yield. We got to use these soil health principles as offensive outcomes too. Actively, these principles are part of the herbicide program, part of the moisture management program, part of the fertilizer program, and also now part of the sustainability program. They can drive real dollars to our bottom line. I'm seeing a huge opportunity come in this space, okay? Everyone's hearing about different soil health initiatives, sustainability programs. There's about 400 different companies here talking about carbon and carbon programs. Holy smokes. But the reason that so much of this is being pushed and why I'm so hot on it as well is this slide, okay? The finance sector, the people with the money, they're really where this is being pushed from, okay? So every year there's this big climate conference that the United Nations puts on. It's called COP. A couple years ago at COP 26, some of the biggest financial institutions in the world all made a pact that they're going to be carbon neutral by 2050. Okay, these big financial institutions, that's the banks, the Wall Street companies, the investors, right, that own the shares of all the corporations. The companies in this pact control 60% of the global wealth, $130 trillion under management, okay? These are the guys with the money. If they're going to be carbon neutral, that means the companies that they are shareholders of need to be carbon neutral, right? Those are all the companies that are represented here, that are part of the supply chain organizations, all that. So the people with the money are pushing on the corporations to lower their carbon footprint. And guess what? As farmers, we are in pretty much every single supply chain out there. So if a corporation is going to be carbon neutral, that means their supply chain has got to be carbon neutral. That means we are part of that equation. I think we're going to get into a little bit of that here later on. Don't want to spill all the beans, but the point being is we've got to continue to figure out how to make this stuff work for our operation, that this is not going away. These guys' goal was a 2050 goal. I think that's why we're seeing a lot of these initiatives be pushed out there. Now, they do it in 2050 because they don't really know how to get it done, right? It's a long way away. So that's why you throw a date out there in the future, and these boards and these CEOs, and they're not going to have to deal with it in another 20, 25 years, right? It's going to be somebody else's problem. But the point being is these guys made these big claims. This stuff is not going away. And on the farm, we need to capitalize on it and be in position because there's some real money to be had in this space too. But we do get to, so here's the biggest thing that I think is the opportunity, okay? So I'm going to get in a little bit later in different carbon program stuff. Brandon and I are going to talk about it towards the end. But the big opportunity for the takeaway in this conversation here today is about the Section 45Z tax credit, okay? In the Inflation Reduction Act, there was tax credits, namely 45Z, which is a ethanol, biodiesel, renewable diesel, and sustainable aviation fuel tax credit. There's also a tax credit called 40B. Secretary Vilsack and the director of the EPA are coming here tomorrow, and they are going to be making announcements about these tax credits. That's a big piece of why they're coming here. They've been talking about it for a long time. They're going to be announcing this. How this works. This is the ethanol context for corn, okay, to simplify, but it works for soybeans as well. Also works for sorghum, for you Milo guys. Okay, so the ethanol company earns a tax credit for lowering their carbon intensity score. Corn is more than 50% of the carbon intensity of the ethanol today. So the ethanol has a footprint at the facility. It uses energy to produce the fuel, and it uses corn going into it. Today, corn has a high carbon footprint. That's put on us by the Department of Energy via the GREET model. There's a brand new GREET model going to be coming out tomorrow as well. The GREET model gives us a carbon intensity score. Every single one of our operations has a carbon intensity score. On average, it's around 29.1. Kind of hard to see the number there, but every county has a number. But by implementing these soil health principles, by farming just more efficiently, better yield, reduce tillage, use cover crops, utilize some of these nutrient management practices, you can lower your carbon intensity score. And by lowering your carbon intensity score, that can be turned into low carbon fuel. The ethanol companies can earn tax credits, and they pay us as farmers cash for those low carbon bushels. So for a quick example, on my farm, my carbon intensity score is negative 4.1. That has a total potential tax credit value of about $1.92 per bushel. I did 212 bushel corn last year. That's $406 an acre. So the value of this data, the value of our carbon story, is super valuable as a carbon inset or a scope 3 reduction in terms of carbon intensity. We need to be paying attention to this. This is just the tip of the spear of companies looking to lower their carbon footprint starting on the farm.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Yeah, we'll get into some details kind of at the end on opportunities there. Brandon, I'm going to head your way next. So we've kind of got a setup here of how and why, nutrients can end up in the water supply. What does that mean as an impact to a community that is facing challenges from that? And what's the cost of ultimately not solving this issue?
Yeah, in Nebraska, we're not necessarily worried about getting water off the fields. We're trying to figure out how to get water onto the fields. And one of the challenges we've come up with is we have some nitrate issues in our groundwater. And, in Nebraska, we sit on top of the Ogallala. We want to protect that resource as much as we can. But also part of that is not just the underground water source, but the river systems. They do feed some of our large metropolitan areas as well. And if you look on this map here, look at the color. The green is good. Purple is really bad. So what that means is the closer you get to purple, the higher the nitrates are in the groundwater. And couple of the biggest corn producing counties in Nebraska have some of the highest nitrates in kind of that south central part of the state there on the map. And so it becomes a lot of challenges. So in my county, we have a very high pediatric cancer rate that the UNMC the University of Nebraska Medical Center has been studying, trying to figure out what's going on there. And we can have discussions all day long whether this is legacy nitrogen, what's going on, but at some point, nitrogen, if I've been hearing it for 30 years that it was nitrogen that was put on the soil 30 years ago, well, we are part of that problem now. So trying to figure out how we can mitigate that risk and figure out how we can get those orange and those dark orange and those purple areas more into a green area, something that's a whole lot safer for the drinking water. And one of the challenges that happens is we see in small communities that they start having trouble finding good groundwater to supply their wells. In our little town, it's not a nitrogen issue, it's actually manganese, but another little town about 10 miles north of me, it's uranium. And uranium gets released naturally. It's naturally occurring in the groundwater, but it gets released by high nitrates. So we end up with these multiple problems that are happening because of high nitrates in the groundwater. And so we're trying to find those solutions to help with this. What is it? How do we convince farmers? How do we to lower the amount of synthetic nitrogen they're putting on? Is it a first, obviously cover cropping, no tilling, but let's start adding the biologicals. Let's start letting the soil do what it needs to do and the crop be able to pull some of those nitrates out of the groundwater, because we've got a problem in Nebraska, and I know we've got at least one other farmer in Nebraska here who can, he has to follow some pretty strict protocols because of the area he's in, and it becomes a challenge for us just to figure out how are we going to do this long term. How are we going to mitigate this risk? But ultimately, it's part of being a good neighbor. I can do everything right on my farm, but if my little town of 400 people has to drill a new well, who pays for that? The town of 400, they have to drill a new well, or does that end up, potentially do they start looking out to other sources? Where is that pollution coming from? Where is the high nitrates and other challenges starting at? And so we've been really concentrating on this, trying to figure out what is the best course of action, because we don't want the heavy hand of the government. We're blessed in Nebraska. We have 23 natural resource districts that they self-monitor, where they have their own boards made up by farmers and town people trying to figure out how to work in each of their own districts to make sure we're doing things properly. But it's become a gigantic challenge, and we really look at it something like source is one of the solutions to the problem.
Appreciate that. Thank you. So I'll kind of open it back up to Mitchell and you, Brandon, and you guys can kind of exchange back and forth. But we understand that changing practices can be uncomfortable, and putting on less fertilizer feels risky, right? Just especially based on several good years of what I'm doing is working as a producer. So what is out there in terms of programs, certifications, financial opportunities, so that we can start moving in the right direction to reduce some of the challenges that Brandon just pointed out?
Yeah, I mean, and obviously this stuff is going to continue to happen, right? And I think, Brandon, you had mentioned it. We don't want this to be regulated. We don't want this to be government that's forcing us to do these things. We do need to continue to do better. And we're moving in a good direction, but we still have a long way to go. So lots of different programs we can hit on here, but let's start with the carbon side of things first. There's kind of 3 buckets of carbon programs that you might look at to get some of these monies. One is a carbon offset. That's create a ton of carbon based on practice changes, and that credit gets sold to anybody on the open market. You have to abide by additionality, practice change. You have to have permanence, and you have to the pricing competes with all these other voluntary markets, and that makes it tough for agriculture. Then there's carbon insets, where that still takes practice change usually, but it's internal to a supply chain. So it's a company that's buying a carbon credit internal to where they purchase and where their supply shed is. So instead of selling to anybody, now it's being sold to somebody internal to your supply chain. That's a offset versus a inset. What I was talking about with this carbon intensity thing is a scope 3 reduction, or not a carbon credit, but the carbon intensity score per bushel. So it's not sold as a credit on its own, but your commodity, your crop, is sold at a premium based on the carbon intensity score. You can use cover crops, you can use manure, you can decrease synthetic fertilizer, grow yield. All those things help to improve your score. But it's associated to the bushel, so there's no contracts or no long-term commitments and things like that. It's just what's the score, and then it gets sold. You cannot stack different carbon programs because you can only sell the carbon credit once, right? You can't have different people take credit for the same carbon, but you can layer in different cost share programs and different things that will pay for the individual practices. Brandon, do you want to maybe hit on thoughts on those?
One of the things that we're seeing as well, and a lot of these things tie together, it's not just carbon, obviously. It's not just reducing nitrogen. We do have the Climate Smart Commodities program out there that Secretary Vilsack announced 2 years ago here at Commodity Classic. And so that's another one that is covering every state, almost every state, like 100 different crops or whatever the number is. And so there's a program out there for everybody that you can look into and try to figure out how it fits into your own operation, no matter what you're growing, and see if there's a way to get paid to put on cover crops and try to really help with some of those, to offset some of the costs that we know come from trying new things. It's really hard to sit there and say, I'm going to try cover crops, whether or not they pay. But if you have somebody else out there really looking at that, saying, here, we've got a program for you, just find the one that works. And also to the point of, there's some of the major corporations that are starting to really look into how is it we can help farmers. Some of them are around here that you don't normally see at a Commodity Classic. We think of it as what's the tires we're going to kick around on the new tractor, what's the latest and greatest in seed or biologicals, but you see somebody like PepsiCo running around, and they've got some sustainability programs that they're trying to roll out that they're willing to put some significant dollars behind to really help us find that next step, because they know they have to meet their sustainability goals, but they also realize that they need to be good stewards of the ground as well, and really help the farmers do that. So there are plenty of programs out there. You can, if you're not sure where to reach out to one, go to obviously one of the commodity groups here, go on their website. They probably can direct you in the right place. The website for the Climate Smart Commodities has a really good dashboard on it as well. So there's a lot of different programs out there.
Then, John, maybe just quickly your direction. So it wouldn't be a certification or a program, but management practice and utilization of variable rate technology is another opportunity, probably underutilized by a lot of the folks in the room. You have some solutions in that department that I think would also be a fair next step for someone on this path. If you want to talk about that for a minute.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. As just the example there earlier around the spatial critical level, right? It really comes with understanding that environment and water movement, and think about what's happening with water where you have it in areas where it's saturated. We know we're going to have increased mineralization. We can have more leaching. We also have different rates of diffusion. And so what I was trying to illustrate is with that understanding, that's the approach that we want to take with variable rate applications of LP and K, and being able to apply more where we need it and are at a risk, and less where we don't need it and we need to avoid the risk. On top of that, it's how we think about our nitrogen program. So a tool that we offer through our advanced agrolytics is variable rate nitrogen stabilizer. So making sure that in those environments that are at risk for nitrogen loss, we're stabilizing that and accounting for that, so we make sure that what we want to end up in the plant is taken up by the plant. So that's really the foundation of what we are trying to do from our aspect of as a company, is to just assess what is that risk for my nutrient loss, and then what can we do by environment to management. So those are a couple of the things that we offer as services to growers to help mitigate that risk.
Perfect, thank you. So this doesn't happen all that often, but we're perfectly on time, which allows some Q&A. So I have about 5 minutes here or so if we have any questions from the audience for any of the four of us really up here on the stage. Yeah.
If on Mitchell's program, my corn scores a very low score, but I have no place to store it, so I store it at the local elevator. How is that segregated, or does it need to be?
Yeah, so I think for some of these programs, so going back to like some of these programs and any of these initiatives are all field by field, right? So each individual field could have different practices, could have different programs, and in our case, each field will have a carbon intensity score. So each field has a score. If you sell direct to town, every load would have that CI score on the scale ticket. And now the elevator, if you're selling to the elevator, they now own those loads, own those scores, and they blend them and blend the corn physically and blend the data digitally, that now they have a carbon intensity score. And when they go and sell it to the ethanol plant or to whoever else, they can sell that carbon intensity score with it. But I guess it ends up being, it depends on if you are going to still just store the grain there, then you still own that allotment of bushels that you produced, and you own your CI score with those bushels, then you could sell them later.
So even though the corn was commingled
Yeah.
with other
Potential.
stored corn, I still have
Potential. Those.
1,000 bushels at CI.
Yeah, so his question being, how we're going about it with our verifier is that you would have a verified allotment of called 100,000 bushels. If you're scoring them on your own farm, or storing them at your uncle's place, storing them in town, if you still own that 100,000 bushels, you own those 100,000 bushels and own that CI score. Then when you sell the bushels and sell the data, now the next person owns it. If the elevator buys your corn and buys your data, now they own it and they blend it. But those are there's some nuances to this that, again, hopefully we get some clarity in these announcements tomorrow. But nonetheless, it boils back to knowing what the value of your data is for each field. Know what you're signing up for in these different programs. And farmers really have an amazing story to tell here. And it all boils back to having the data. That's what creates the value. We just need to know how to track it and make sure that folks get compensated correctly. Good question. So his question's on, is that data in the Haney test? Nope, separate thing. So on the Haney test, I like that on being able to quantify soil health, build up. It's a decision-making tool, right, to see, are we implementing these things correctly? How can we tweak our fertilizer? How's that biological reacting in our system? A CI score is actually based on your management practices. What's your fertilizer program? What's your yield? Do you use cover crops? Do you use manure, tillage? It's every pass across the field divided by the bushels that came off of that field, or that acre. And but it's done with a calculation called the GREET model, developed by the U.S. Department of Energy. Over here, Steve.
Yeah, Mitch, a question for you. So in regards to the inset or offset programs today, the farmers can take advantage. Will the GREET model be the standardization you believe going forward for all carbon programs?
I think it's going to, his question's on, is the GREET model going to be the standard going forward for all of them, or how's that going to impact? I don't know that the GREET model will be the standard for all of it. The GREET model and the CI thing, this is government getting involved in this carbon space, right? And that GREET model is developed by the Department of Energy. And there's a brand new version of that model to come out tomorrow for sustainable aviation fuel and for these tax credits. So it's a government tax credit using a government tool. I don't believe that non-biofuel industries will adopt that biofuel tool or that US-based tool from a global perspective, but I think it's going to influence folks to have to figure out how do we quantify the actual footprint of the bushel, of the pound of beef, of the gallon of milk. I'm very bullish on the concept that I think we're not necessarily going to be selling a lot of our carbon as an asset on its own, but we're going to be talking about what's the footprint of our bushel, of our pounds of meat, our eggs, whatever the product is you're producing. It's going to be what is your footprint. So they might build on top of that GREET model, but I really think the precedent that's being set in the biofuel space is going to influence other folks because there's going to be more connectivity on my bushel and my data went to this guy than to this guy. It's just a little bit cleaner. But we'll know more tomorrow. I definitely encourage you guys to pay attention to that talk tomorrow. 45Z and 40B.
Research done on radon gas coming out of the ground in Nebraska and building stations and that it was thousands of years affected our soil.
His question is any data on rayon gas and stuff like that coming out? That's a tough one. I thought uranium was wild.
Yeah, uranium's wild enough. The radon, I'm not 100% sure. I will. There's a lot of stuff I'll try to answer. I will not try to answer that one because we know the radon's there. I just don't know what the tie-in is there. But now gave me something to look up.
Homework. On the back.
Is there a better way to measure soil health than the Haney test? Because it occurs to me that when you try Haney test, it changes hourly. That's not very good to have a baseline hourly. Possibly it's not really efficient, it's not effective as far as a good measurement. Do you have any other ideas?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Maybe
Go first.
Jeff, maybe you got some thoughts too. Yeah, it changes all the time. I've been doing Haney testing weekly for the last 7 years. Okay, and it's not just the Haney parameters that change. Organic matter changes, pH changes, all these things that we were told that really don't change that much. Now, we're talking about soil sampling here, right? We're talking about actually measuring like a gram of soil to represent millions of pounds of soil. Definitely not an exact science at all. I preferred, from the Haney perspective, I like using the Regen Ag Lab. They're out in Nebraska. They are doing it up to par and at the standard. So that's one of the things to look at is what lab are you using? Again, I recommend the Regen Ag Lab. I recommend doing the Haney test in the spring, but you're absolutely right. It changes all the time. So use it in the same time every year and know that the weather and the soil is going to impact it. Happy to cross-compare notes on our weekly soil sampling that we've done to compare a one-time sample versus our weekly soil sample stuff. The best way to measure soil health is a shovel, by far. Use a shovel out there, seeing what's going on with that soil, the smell, the structure, the earthworms. That's the best. For some of these other more stable components, you can do dry combustion organic carbon soil sampling. That's what the carbon credit markets use to measure that stable soil organic carbon. Dry combustion organic carbon is the test there. But there's a variety of other soil health tests, right? PLFA, trace genomics, lots and lots of different stuff. Those change all the time too. They're all indicators. All this stuff's an indicator. Same thing on how do you measure human health, right? All we have here is indicators. All we have here is being able to monitor, are we adopting these principles correctly? And the number one thing is profitability.
Yeah. Yeah, you covered most of what I did, and we just hit time there, so that was a good, robust answer. So I think most of us are going to be available. We're going to head down to the sound booth. We're 11:30, which is downstairs and towards, it'd be my left, I guess, so kind of towards the end out in the middle of the big trade show floor. So most of us will migrate down there after this talk. Feel free to swing by, and ask any additional questions, and we're available. And
Jeff, you didn't tell them there's beers down there later.
We do have a happy hour as well, yes.
Tell the people what they want, Jeff.
The most important aspect of coming to that booth. So thank you for spending time with us here this afternoon. I know there's a lot to see and do, so thanks for spending some time with us.
Cool.